Welcome to Off the Record News. I'm your host, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. Off the Record News is a weekly news cablecast program coming to you from the SPNN studios in St. Paul. Now, last week we were reporting on the St. Paul City Council and their discussion and passage of the Climate Resilience Plan. This was back in December of 2019, but it is certainly a very important issue for St. Paul and probably some of the neighboring cities as well, because what happens in St. Paul seems to trickle down to all the other suburbs around it. So that's why it's important for us to know what's going on in St. Paul. Now, we are going to continue our report because last week we covered much of what the report was, in particular as how it pertains to transportation and the usage of a single ownership cars and the council reaction to the recommendations. We did not get to all of the resident comments that were made at that public hearing, which I think are all very important to at least get out to the public so you can hear what other people in your community have to say about this plan, about this issue, about solutions, about complications. So that's why we want to have part two. Now, to help me with tonight's newscast is Mr. Greg Copeland, who is a resident of St. Paul, and he was here last week also. He's been watching this topic very closely, and so thank you, Mr. Copeland, for being here.
Pleasure to be with you as always.
And we have a lot of film footage to go through, but what we're going to have first, for those of you that may have missed last week's newscast, is that we're going to play one or two of the clips from last week just to bring you up to speed as to where we are in the meeting. Our first clip is the why. Why are we talking about a climate resiliency plan? Let's take a look.
Are the areas in which we're going to have to adapt to the already changing climate and become a more resilient city. The second half of the plan is all about the ways in which we're going to do our part to reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that we can prevent much worse impacts of continued climate change over time.
Now, Mr. Copeland, last week we talked about how this is really quite a big issue. Obviously, it is beyond the borders of St. Paul.
Absolutely.
And that there's really a drive in at the state level, the county level, the national level to really take steps to try to address this. Mm-hmm. And I think it's good to have a discussion about what can a city, a municipality do. However, it seems like they really haven't talked about some of the unintended consequences of some of the recommendations of this plan.
Absolutely. And one comes to mind, and we talked a bit about it last week. I happened to attend the Wild game last night, which we won, by the way, against Las Vegas, 4-0, I'll have you know. But, you know, I got off the bus in front of the brand new multi-level parking garage that is opposite the Excel Center. You know, somebody didn't clue those folks in on that plan, because here we have literally thousands of spots already in other parts of the city, and they've built this new since this 2015 study that we referenced last time. So it was kind of interesting to see the investment dollars that it takes. And then also the city is asking the state for a ton of money to redo the big parking area, the riverside area next to the Science Center for a redo of that huge parking complex to serve the Excel Center. So, we have an incongruence, an inalignment, could we say? I don't know, whatever you want to call it, of policy and reality in the city of St. Paul. That's really nothing new, but since it's kind of right in the face of the downtown boys and girls, I'm sure Russ Stark, the sustainability officer, understands what's going on there.
Yes.
And I doubt that that was part of the Bloomberg grant that was funded by Mayor Bloomberg, who wants to be our president.
You know, last week we were focusing on that aspect of the plan that is looking at how to change and modify transportation and the types of transportation that people use and the ownership of single occupancy cars. So let's take a look at our next clip where they address that issue.
On the transportation side, two main strategies, no surprises here. We're going to have to reduce the amount of driving that we do in single occupant vehicles as well, which has to involve significant increases in transit ridership as well as biking and walking for shorter trips, which has to involve significant investments in our transit system, paired with the investments that we are making, frankly, on the biking and walking side.
So when you look at that chart, it really sets out the reductions that they're looking to make in the single occupancy vehicles that are out on the road today. And one of the questions that we asked last week is that in St. Paul, how are they going to address that neighborhood by neighborhood? Because are people going to give up their vehicles? Certainly it depends on if they've got reliable mass transportation and bus service. But we see Ramsey County focusing so much of their transportation dollars on boondoggles such as the Rush Line, where there isn't the congestion, where there isn't the population to support it, where they just want to say, well, look what we did, rather than say, well, where are we having bottlenecks in our bus system and how can we address that? You know, we just had a big snowstorm, Mr. Copeland, just a few days ago. And I was driving along White Bear Avenue, and I wished I had somebody with me who could be taking photos while I was driving. Because this is what I identified along White Bear Avenue, which is a well-used bus route. There were people who were standing near one of the bus benches, but because of all the snow that was crunched up in the front of the bus bench, they actually had to stand behind the bus bench, and that while then the bus came along, then they had to figure out how to jump up and over the snowbanks to get then into the road so they could get on the bus. Another bus stop, where it was one of those bus stops that's got the little roof over and that kind of thing, so it's more of a shelter. Well, that wasn't cleared out very well either, and you had this dad with the baby stroller and the baby in the stroller busy. He just had gotten off of a bus, and he's busy trying to maneuver his baby stroller through the snow around the corner to try to get across the road so then he could walk down the other side of the street, which didn't have its sidewalk shoveled or plowed, and so he had to walk in the street with his baby stroller and his baby to get to where he was going. And then there were plenty of other bus stops that were just the one that have the single little sign up, and they're all plowed in and you can't get to them. And I'm thinking to myself, maybe what Ramsey County and the Met Council should invest in as part of their comprehensive transportation system is a works program where they've got people out there shoveling. That's what they need. They need people to shovel snow at the bus stops when there's snowstorms. That's it, pure and simple.
Well,
now, isn't that an easy solution?
Once upon a time, they actually did that. I've had the same experience in my neighborhood on Payne Avenue, climbing over the top of the snowbank, either entering the bus or exiting the bus. And I want to go back to the hockey game. Okay?
Yes, okay.
Because you talk about the number of people coming in from outside our community, and are they going to give up their cars? Well, last night, I must tell you that after the game, and I was with someone else, and I said, we're ahead here. There's only 2 minutes left. It's 4-0. Why don't we get out there early so we don't have to wait in a long line for the bus? What line? What line? we had the 21 going by, we had the 63, we had all these different buses. The 64, unfortunately, didn't run by there. But honestly, there was no line. There was hardly anybody on the bus. 54 went by. I mean, and yet you got this traffic jam. Nothing was moving for 15 minutes or so after the game. And so there's so much cultural change that has to occur here, and I'll give them the benefit of calling it cultural change. But when I see the chart that was up there that Mr. Stark was displaying for the city council, we've got a lot of work to do. And if they're going to cut back that soon, great. There was a piece in the paper as well today about the other little bus line going out to Woodbury, the Gold Line, where that didn't rank as high for the money. So now, the grant application's in trouble, and the only way around that is to build more parking out at the other end of the line in Woodbury for the cars to come into town. And they hope that that's going to move the application up from minimal to a medium improvement in the system, which is the minimal level that it has to be at in order to get any money from the feds, because this thing isn't going to be built without federal money.
Right, and that, of course, is to encourage and attract those people who live just across the border in Wisconsin, who work for the state of Minnesota and the county and the municipalities, to then go and park at that park and ride and take the bus, which has been built, by the way, for them, to come down to downtown St. Paul.
I am shocked. Shocked. No, I remember years ago I was on the CIB in St. Paul, and one of the people that worked in county personnel was on there. We're walking back to the parking area, and she said, "Great, do you know how many of our county employees live in Wisconsin?" I said, "No." She says, at that time, and this is 15 plus years ago, she was estimating it was somewhere around 20 or approaching 20%. So, and she said that may be conservative.
Yes, well, I've heard similar numbers.
Okay, I think it's even more now.
Well, it probably has to do with lower taxes.
No objection.
Well, now let's continue on as we take a look at our next clip, which shows a graph of the different types of human activities that contribute to this climate change and the need for looking at how we need to modify our behavior. Let's take a look.
The next red line down, the dashed red line, shows the accumulation of all the actions we've identified in this plan would get us to 70 to 75% reduction by 2050, not down to net zero. The point of which is just to say that we literally haven't figured out how to get all the way down to zero by 2050. We know it's going to be challenging, and some of those particularly challenging pieces will be the ways in which we fuel larger vehicles, the ways in which we travel in an intercity way, in planes, for example, and the use of natural gas as a power source for those really big energy users, such as manufacturing and industry. Those will be some of the toughest pieces of all.
So you can see from that graph that darker blue that's at the top, the biggest, widest swath is the commercial electric. And that really is going to be a big challenge because that's where jobs come from. So now not only do we have the conflict between the usage of cars, and the city's got all these ramps to support their stadiums and all their other big endeavors. Okay, so that's an issue, but now what are we going to do about commercial electric? Are we going to say, well, we don't want to have business in our community because we're concerned about the footprint? Well, then we're not going to have jobs. Well, if you don't have jobs, then the people who are in your community are poor, or they got to use some transportation to get to Shakopee where the jobs are. Yeah. So you see, this is not an easy nut to crack.
No.
And that's why when we get to the point and they've got the public hearing and they're telling the public, well, you've got a minute to talk about this weighty subject, it seems actually disingenuous because this subject everybody should have at least an hour to talk about. Not at a meeting, of course, but it deserves a lot of discussion, and not just by the lobbyists and not just by the special interest groups, but by the people of the communities, because they're the ones who are going to be affected in the long term, their children in the long term, but even themselves in the short term.
Right. And, you know, you've got a pretty short horizon. I mean, you know, we're talking about 30 years. And people, 30 years, that's a long time. Well, it's not really. You know, as somebody who's 30 years older than I was, you know, and I can remember it wasn't that long ago. The math is pretty simple. And young people today that are sitting out there, beware.
Right.
So these policies have real consequences in your lives, and frankly, things have to be affordable. Things have to be real. Theoretical doesn't work, you know, when you're trying to actually get from point A to point B. When there is no transportation, whether it's the bus that's not there, the Lyft, the Uber, or your own car doesn't work, or whatever it is, we all understand what that really means.
Right, exactly. People have to get to where they need to go because they're working, they're going to school, they got families, there's daycare, there's everything that we do. We can't just be housed in our little high-density housing and say, well, okay, we're going to sit there like little mushrooms. That's not a quality of life.
Of course, we could hope that the innovations of Star Trek from the 1960s, the transporter, will arrive in time, so we don't have to worry about how we're going to get from A to B. But until they come, you know, we've got the age-old problem. And, you know, if you've ever had the opportunity to go to a place like Rome, which is renowned for roads that were built literally in the pre-Christian era, you know, they're still there. So people have been using roads for a long time, and only if our roads lasted as well, Diana.
Well, there must be a science to that, too.
There is indeed.
Well, now the council had some questions about community input, and then there's a discussion about continuing input once this plan is passed. So let's take a look as they start that discussion.
But number one, the intent is to create an annual work plan and budget for our climate resilience work. So I hope to come back to you sometime early in 2020 with the 2020 climate resilience work plan, based in large part on the things that were included in the 2020 budget, but specifically how what progress we're going to make in 2020. And then one of the most common points of feedback we got on the plan was people want a way to continue to engage in this work with the city. And so there's a recommendation in the plan now to create a climate and resilience advisory board for the city. And we're committing to doing that. I'm in discussions with city staff and departments about exactly how we're going to do that, hopefully to be launched in 2020 as a way of continuing the engagement with our community and holding ourselves accountable to the plan as well.
So he says at this point that one of the recommendations is to form this climate resiliency advisory board made up of residents of, I'm assuming, St. Paul, who are interested in this topic. And that was something that they heard from the community, that they wanted continued engagement. But as we go through these clips, there's a little wavering on exactly what does that mean. So let's take a look at our next clip as we continue.
But it's also day one of a whole new body of work for the city. And there's also work going on to make sure that the climate action plan and the comp plan are well aligned. Because the comp plan process preceded this, and we're still getting final comments back from the Met Council on it, we wanted to hold off on further changes to the comp plan. But after the comp plan is finished and this is adopted, there's going to be some work to make sure that they are synchronized, and that could involve some comp plan amendments.
So, of course, now this is certainly good planning ahead, because how you guide your land usage and your comprehensive plan for the next 20 years should be looking at other types of plans that you're putting in place, such as this climate resiliency plan, which in part is looking at reducing the amount of roads available, the width of roads, a lot of these different types of things that have a great impact on transportation. So certainly that does have an impact on your land usage and how you guide the land. And certainly your commercial usage of your property. Now, one thing we talked about, Mr. Copeland, a few shows ago was when we were covering the Hillcrest development. They were talking about how they wanted to narrow the roads and minimize it so that you couldn't have heavy truck traffic in that development, and yet they're claiming they're going to have 1,000 jobs. So again, we find this constant conflict between the aspirational goal and then the way that they design things. So which is it? Is it going to be 1,000 good paying jobs, or are you going to have a development where you can't have heavy trucks on the road who are part and parcel of having good paying jobs at the rate of 1,000 of them in a short, small development?
Yeah, unless they think that some branch of, I don't know, Apple is going to move in with a technical park where everybody's going to be just using their mental capital and doing digital things. Yeah, you know, if it's going to be sort of the traditional east side of St. Paul employer, there's going to be trucks, because the people who live on the east side make things. They do things. They
Right.
use their hands.
Right, or if it's like, say, it's a distribution center and is using up,
Good
you know,
example.
5 acres worth of the
Sure.
property for a huge distribution center. Well, distribution centers use large trucks. That's
Indeed.
how they get their goods in and out of that distribution center.
Well, and I'm looking at what the Port Authority's created recently on the east side, the printing plant there on the old 3M site. Certainly large building, gotta use trucks to get the paper in and get the product out. The bakery, the Ballinger Bakery, certainly a lot of trucks there. I mean, on and on. I can't think of too much that they've done. They've even got a commercial equipment business, used to be on the on Fairview area, and it's McQueen Equipment, municipal maintenance type stuff. I mean, there it is. It's all heavy equipment. So I noticed New York City is going to require that all of that type of stuff, the ambulances, the fire trucks, the garbage trucks, all that whole reservoir of municipal equipment will be required to be electric in the next 40 years, so actually 20 years. So,
And there again, we're looking at the commercial electric as being a big portion of the footprint of our human endeavors. And going back to the Hillcrest development, if they're looking at they're going to be developing 1,000 jobs, okay, so are they going to then use this climate resilience plan and have that be the yardstick by which they measure the type of commercial development that goes in there in order to make good on their promise of 1,000 jobs? You see, even the council has a conflict between what they are promising to do on one topic versus what they're doing on another topic, but I don't see them having that bigger discussion about how they're going to reconcile the two missions that they have in front of them.
well, it seems to me that what this resilience plan has in common with the Hillcrest project, I'll call it because there is no plan, is that the involvement of citizens is an afterthought. The city council approved purchasing the Hillcrest with no citizen involvement whatsoever. The Port Authority made the decision for the city council. We bought it, here's the bill, pay us. Okay, good, we'll bill everybody in town so much money for the next 25 years on a bond issue we're going to sell so that the Port Authority can be reimbursed. And then on the other project, this Bloomberg climate plan, they're putting citizens involvement, a committee of this after they've come to the city council, got it approved. That's not the St. Paul way.
Right.
In
And-
St.
and-
Paul,
and
we
they-
love committees.
Yeah,
Come on.
and they did have their 360 committee who worked on this, but I think that they were sort of handpicked to work on this
That's an
project, weren't they?
activist group. That's a political group. It's an international group, Climate 350, and they had various involvement from the business community because of the change in the commercial heating and whatnot, which is pretty much a downtown system, as we all know, with the energy program, and so But in terms of and I went to a meeting in my neighborhood about, and they were held all with the district councils and other people that wanted to hear them. But in terms of the plan itself, the construction and approval, where was the citizen involvement on the front end?
Right, and as you mentioned, okay, so now we're talking about it on the back end. And at the council meeting, council member Kasim Basari, he actually asked more questions about what are we going to do about having that citizen engagement now after the fact. So let's take a look.
This plan, my question and concern is how much of the community input was put into this plan. Excel is a great partner to the city, and as we learned earlier, with resolutions we passed earlier, they were willing to work with us. I'm kind of wondering is there any plans to add a committee or a community committee that will oversee this plan coming to the future of this plan?
Council President and Councilmember Basuri, thank you for the question. And yes, that was one of the strongest pieces of feedback that we heard from the community, a desire to stay engaged and to create an advisory body. And so we're hoping to launch that new advisory body next year.
But he doesn't just stop there. He actually has a follow-up question. He wants to hear more about what are the details. You say it's a plan and a recommendation, but what are the details of this? So let's see if he's able to get any details on this citizen engagement.
Just a follow-up question. And with the committee, how would that be how would that be created, and what is the dynamic of that? Do you know that yet, or is that still in the plans?
Some early thinking about that I can share with you. There's been some discussion about the issue of solid waste and perhaps creating a committee just to focus on that issue. We already have a transportation committee of our planning commission, and so we don't think we want to create a new body to also look at transportation issues. So the idea is that this body would focus on specifically energy and climate resilience and the issue of climate justice. Like, how do we, as we move this work forward, how do we do it equitably and make sure that we are benefiting communities across the city and that it's really a climate action plan for all.
Okay, so we heard twice that yes, there's a recommendation to form this committee, and it sounded like when it was first described that it was specifically to do exactly what Councilmember Basari was asking about, to be engaged in the oversight of the plan, follow whether or not it's meeting benchmarks, about any of that. And yet, then there's a walk back. Did you notice that, Mr. Copeland? There was a walking back to say, well, yeah, but we've got this committee that's talking about this waste committee, and we got the committee that's talking about this other thing, we got whatever. And since, well, then we don't need to really have, this committee that you're talking about. And we've discussed. And who's discussed it? Not this council. This council hasn't discussed it. I wanted to know who discussed it, because you heard him say, we have discussed. We who? We who has discussed this? And so here he is now walking back and saying, okay, but we're going to have a committee that's going to be getting together to talk about the social justice of it all. Well, isn't that the bigger discussion that maybe this council should have had before they decided to go and say we're just going to adopt it without addressing those bigger issues?
Well, this goes to the heart of how public policy is not being made by the elected officials of the city, and that the staff is basically got the tail in hand, and they wag it when they want, because obviously the staff is the we. It's not the council. It certainly wasn't Kasim Basari, the member at the time who was in Ward 6. So, I don't know, and I'm sure that if the other council members had known the answer, they would have informed or commented. I've often seen the council president brief the council when there seems to be a question that's not sufficiently answered by staff, because I think she probably gets more inside briefings than most anybody there. It's not unusual, but honestly, again, in St. Paul, typically, if you're bringing forth a whole new model of doing business, and I would argue that a zoning transportation committee is not a climate resilience committee. Ultimately, maybe someday they'll all blend together in their work product, but a solid waste committee is not. They just tacked on the solid waste charge that we all pay to our property taxes because, they could, to pay for this mandatory garbage thing. So thank you, City Council, Mayor Carter, and John Marty. Honestly, this is the kind of stuff that goes on, and nobody's got a concept of where we're going to end up at the end of the day that brings people that pay the bills into the discussion. And that's the issue.
Right. Now, we're moving on to then the opening of the public hearing, because this was an item for public hearing that night. So let's get started and hear what the ground rules are for public hearing for this very weighty issue that is like the biggest issue facing the St. Paul City Council for their future and their public policy on everything. So let's take a look.
What I'd like to do, just to get a sense of how much time we're going to spend on this public hearing, can people who would like to speak tonight, please just give us a show of hands. Okay. So what I want to do, and we made these amendments in advance so that if that was your issue, you can just be like, yes, I won on that issue, and it's in the plan. But it looked like there was about 30 people who had their hands up. So if every single person talks for 2 minutes, we're going to have an hour-long public hearing plus transition time in between.
Oh my goodness, my gosh. 30 people want to speak, and if you all get your 2 minutes, which, by the way, in Maplewood, at Maplewood you get at least 3 minutes, but 2 minutes, that means, we're going to have to spend an hour on this issue listening to all you people. Yeah. Well, isn't that amazing? I just thought to myself, and you could see that there were like 30 people all lined up ready to speak and say something. So then let's hear where it goes from there.
So I want to encourage people, I'm going to put 30 minutes on the clock and encourage people to try to keep their comments to about a minute. It's going to be hard because by the time you say your name, you're about halfway through that time. But give us your highs, give us like the parts that you're supportive of. If somebody says what you want to say, you can just agree with them. And we will work on getting through a public hearing. This is the last item on our agenda for 2019. So I want to give it an appropriate amount of time.
So this is their last public hearing of the meeting, and they don't have enough time just to sit around and listen just a little bit longer to what the comments are. So so you see the stage is set to chill the public input right from the beginning. Whether you're for it or against it, it's already being chilled because they're automatically setting the timer for a total of 30 minutes for the public hearing.
Yeah, they've discounted the public's input by 50%. If you buy that they could get it done in an hour, which that's their assumption. So there's their 50% discount on the most important thing, right? How many dollars have gone into this? I mean, Mr. Stark, I think he doubled his pay when he took the job. He used to be on the city council, and now he gets a better paycheck. But in any event, this is worth a whole lot more time. I mean, just you and I sitting here, we're going to take up a couple of shows, 2 hours, with two of us looking at what the public's had to say, what the resilience officers had to say. I mean, it's unreasonable. And, you know, people took time out of their lives to come down to the city to help do a better job for the city. And apparently, well, it's not worth it, you know. Only a minute. You got a minute. Come on.
Well, let's continue with the public hearing.
But I think we were shooting for about a 30-minute public hearing as opposed to doing who's for and who's against, because for crying out loud, we're for it, right? So let's start out with people, if you want to line up, and we'll get going here on our public hearing. We're going to run the timer at 30 minutes. I'm going to give you a sign. Come on up here. You know, we give people, if you have little kids with you and you want to go to the front of the line, that is great with us. And I'll just give you I'll give you the quiet coyote when you're getting to about a minute, just so you have a sense of how long you've talked. All right, welcome.
So she repeated the rules again. Now, I think she has taken more than a minute to say what the rules are to keep everybody to a minute. Now, I guess that's her prerogative, but she said, well, this is an important issue. We're all for it, right? Well, maybe that's why they don't need to listen to anybody, because they don't want to hear what the other aspects of agreeing are. Because you can certainly all agree on the main issue, but sometimes it's how do you get to the end conclusion? What are the methods? How do you approach it? How do you stage it? There's a lot of opportunity to discuss this, even if you're all on the same page with what has to be accomplished.
Right, and I think, you know, one thing we pride ourselves in Minnesota is that our legislature, whether it's the House or the Senate, you know, we have hearings. We have long hearings, longer than some members of the legislature might like if they had control over the clock. But, you know, when the people show up and they want to say something, the legislature takes time to listen.
Yeah.
I mean, they really do.
And at the grassroots level, your city council members should do that as well, because that's where a resident has the most impact and ability to be involved in what's going on in their community is the grassroots, in their community, their town.
Right, and if they'd had the citizens committee up front, they would have gotten a ton of input, and they might have had a better process then, because they involved more people in the proposed policy. And maybe they could have done less amendments. You know, they might have had something that had already had some hearings at the citizen committee level, and would have been a citizen work product. What's wrong with that?
What's wrong with that? Well, now we're going to try to get in as many of the comments as we can in the rest of our program here. If you want to listen to all of it, of course, you can go on the city's website where they have it available for you to watch over the internet. So let's get started.
All right, let's go.
Thank you, Council President Bremo and council members. My name is Mike Son. I live in McAllister Groveland neighborhood, and this is Noah. Hey, can you say hi? He hasn't been here in a little while. He's actually gotten a haircut since the last time he was here. But I just wanted to be real quick. I want to state, kind of reiterate what Councilmember Mitra Nelson said, in that my concern is just the implementation of this. This is a great plan. Russ Stark did awesome work, and now we have a foundation, but I want to make sure that when we get to the meat and potatoes and the hard decisions need to be made, that we're thinking about his generation, and we're thinking about what he has to deal with in 30 years and his kids have to deal with in 60 years. So I just want to reiterate that there are going to be a lot of hard decisions and hard votes coming up, but I feel like we have the majority on this council, a progressive majority that understands the issues. So please just thank you for this hard work, but remember, this is just the start of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now he's got a couple of good points there. You're going to have some hard decisions ahead of you. But because he only has a minute, he can't actually enumerate what those hard decisions are from his perspective that are going to have to be made. Because I am sure that he has a list of hard decisions that he has thought about that could be helpful for this council, but because he has 1 minute, that's all the time there is. Well, let's hear what the next participant has to say.
Council members. My name is Janice Watts. I'm a policy associate at Fresh Energy, and I live in Ward 1, and I'm here to speak on behalf of the Fresh Energy and show our support for the Climate Action Resiliency Plan. I think Father said it enough, that this is about future generations and our collective existence on Earth, and I really appreciate St. Paul for stepping up and taking leadership on this climate emergency that we are in. I just want to really speak to the importance of establishing the community advisory body that's stated in the plan. And just want to say that it really should include representation from our most underserved neighborhoods in St. Paul, and including young people being a part of that body as well. And to really trust in the leadership of the city and to show that there's expertise in many areas and that it should not just solely be focused on climate, but other issues that we're trying to tackle in our city, because that it's all connected.
Quite a large number of the people who stuck in there and got up to say something, because by the time we get to the end of the public hearing, 50% of the people decided to sit down and not give comments, because along the way, interdispersed during the time, they were told, well, we have to, watch your time. If somebody has already said the comment, keep that in mind. We're moving along here pretty good. And so by the time they heard that chilling speech, they decided, well, gosh, I don't want to impose upon the council. They need to get on to their important business, and so I guess other people have said what I had to say, and I guess I'll sit down. But the majority of the people who did stick in there to get up to say something actually were affiliated with various different organizations that are working on this issue. So they know that it is important to get up and speak out, and not to be deterred by language that tells you that, well, we got to hurry up and go home here pretty soon, the clock's ticking, because they are advocating for their issues. So they stuck in there. And some of them even spoke up to 3 minutes, even though they were only supposed to have a minute. So let's take a look at our next clip.
I'm Bobby Scott. I live in Ward 7, and thank you for doing this. I want to thank all of you for being behind it, because it's so important. I'm involved in other climate work, Citizens Climate Lobby, working on the national level. What I would like to do is make sure that you keep pushing to go harder, because this isn't aggressive enough. And we're getting bad news every day. And we need to front load, because every bit of carbon dioxide that we put in the air now, we're going to keep heating up. So I just saw, I have something that I can hand out to all of you, but I'm just going to summarize. Our carbon budget for staying below 2 degrees C may be 40% smaller than we thought it was. We might not be able to attain 1.5 degrees C without negative emissions. At this point, we might be past that. And the 12 years to act conclusion from the IPCC special report is likely overly optimistic, and it was based on starting from November of last year. We're almost to 2020. So we don't have 12 years to act. And we don't have time for incremental policies. And obviously, there's only so much the city can do. But I'm really concerned about education on climate, what the city and maybe the county working together can do to educate people, because there are things in this plan people aren't going to like. And if they don't understand why, there may be backlash.
Yes, there might be backlash, and I'm thinking about if indeed that, these timelines are really moved up. Why is it that this city council and the council before them, that they were intent upon saying, well, we have to build stadiums? Now, isn't that a contributor to going down the path, which is the path we're trying to back up from? And yet the city has done all this stuff. They are a huge contributor, just as much as, oh, the commercial energy users. So you see, but I do appreciate that she brought up the fact that there are these timelines. Well, let's hear the next public comment.
My name is Hannah Hopwood Bruns, and 2 weeks ago I attended the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Madrid, Spain. I learned a lot, and I am so happy to bring my knowledge back to my home city. And just speaking on the advisory committee, I strongly hope that there will be someone on this committee who will speak for and advocate for the homeless population in St. Paul, just because, in my personal opinion, I believe they are the most vulnerable community to the climate crisis, and they are going to feel these effects first. And I also want to echo what was said before me, in that I also hope there will be spots reserved for young people on this board, because by 2050, I'll be 50 years old, and I believe young people deserve to have a voice in this fight. Thank you so much.
Now, we're going to skip ahead to a clip near the end of our clips, and that's clip number 33, because there's a few folks who got up to speak who wanted to address this issue of St. Paul working together with Xcel Energy with regard to this climate resiliency plan. And it was a fascinating a couple of comments. And, you know, again, this is something that really deserved more time than just saying, okay, we have, you know, you have to hustle along here. So let's take a look at clip number 33.
Hi, I'm Aaron Kerr in Ward 5. Just first of all, I want to say I'm really happy to be here. I love coming to these events. It just feels great. It just feels like democracy in action. It's just really, really cool. I'll be really quick. I just want to. There's one little figure that always pops out to me whenever I'm trying to make a point here, and one of it is we have for rooftop solar, we have a potential for 800 MGs. What is that? Megawatts. Sorry, MW. I wrote it wrong. 800 megawatts. And that's 40% of the city's total energy use. So that's pretty huge. I've got 4 kids in St. Paul Public Schools. That came up, someone was talking about that and asked about that. Rooftop solar on the public schools. It just seems like a win-win. People could buy into it, the schools could gain from it, it could be an educational thing. So.
And certainly, if there was a concerted effort and initiative to have solar panels on all of the large commercial buildings with their huge expansive rooftops, imagine how that would help that aspect of commercial electric. But is that something that Xcel would want to get behind? The shareholders, would they want to get behind that? Well, let's continue with our next clip.
I'm just a time check. We've been at this for about only 15 minutes, but I'm seeing the line as, Rob, are you at the end? Are you the closer? Look. Okay, well, and I don't want to cut people off. I mean, this is important and we want to but I'm just checking in and kind of figuring out where we're at. I think we're doing okay.
So that is where the point was taken to interject and say, well, okay, we're looking at the clock, and you could see how many people were standing, that people were already starting to sit down. Well, let's take a look at our next clip and see who still had stamina to get up and speak to the council, even though the clock was ticking.
St. Paul 350. I also volunteer with St. Paul 350 on CARP and the climate resolution that you passed earlier today. I also want to thank council members for the various meetings that they've had with constituents to discuss the climate action plan and the resolution. And I also want to thank Jim Pearson and Nick Martin of Xcel for meeting with us. Although I know we don't see completely eye to eye on all aspects of the resolution, it was very helpful to hear Xcel's point of view, and I hope that we can continue that dialogue. I think that CARP is a great document. There's many things to like about it. One aspect of it, though, I would push back on a little bit, and that is the fact that CARP really wants to basically leave all of the energy generation production decisions to Xcel. We are one of Xcel's biggest customers. We should be using that clout to have a say in our energy future, including generation. I think at a minimum, the city, I would hope, would take some formal positions on the issues in the pending Xcel Integrated Resource Plan when the comment period reopens in the spring. And ideally, I would like to see the city apply for intervener status, if that is at all possible at this point. I'll jump to the end here. The major issue that I see, the one that I would like to see the city engage on, is the possibility of committing the state to decades of new significant fossil fuel infrastructure. I think this is contrary to both the spirit and the specific goals of the CARP. I think solar and wind with grid energy storage, increasingly viable alternatives to natural gas, large power and energy capacity pilot storage projects are already underway in other parts of the country. I know that we cannot suddenly eliminate at this moment all natural gas from the grid, but we desperately need to make a transition away from fossil fuels to occur on a timescale of years and not decades. A new fossil fuel plant in 2025 or so would presumably have to operate for 30 years if it follows the usual pattern. Xcel has been directed by the Public Utilities Commission in the revised IRP to explore some alternatives that does include storage and smaller gas plants, and this is definitely a step in the right direction. And there are other groups such as the Citizen Utility Board, Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, and the Department of Commerce are also leading modeling efforts of alternatives to building major new fossil fuel infrastructure. My main point, I think, is that the city of St. Paul needs to be part of these conversations.
This gentleman had a lot to say to the city council, and you can see how he was trying to jam it all in, and yet he probably did indeed take 2 minutes, which I commend him for sticking to his guns and at least trying to get it out there, because he obviously is making some good recommendations to the council, that when they're looking at this plan, they can't just look and say, well, we want to decrease the amount of cars that the little guy has. We have to take a look at what is Xcel doing. Well, now we have one last clip where another lady talks about Xcel.
Elizabeth Dickinson, Ward 2. First, thank you so much for all of your work on the plan. Thank you to Russ. Thank you for entertaining all of the amendments and for passing the resolution against investing in more fossil fuel infrastructure. Those are all incredibly important things. I'm going to end on a cautionary note, and it's about our relationship with Xcel, because it's very common to hear in City Hall that we're fortunate in having such a good partner in the monopoly investor-owned utility Xcel. First, the people who represent Xcel are terrific. They are. They're lovely people. Would love to have a coffee or beer with them. However, they're representing a monopoly corporation whose primary allegiance is to their shareholders. And recently, the Public Utilities Commission, who oversees their activities on behalf of the public, required Xcel to redo their modeling processes because Xcel wanted to invest in that new fracked gas plant and because Xcel hadn't included enough analysis of renewable energy. Additional concern about Xcel's ability to act as a trusted partner have arisen in Minneapolis, where Xcel is supposed to be helping the city with its climate action plan. And they've had one in place for 5 years. Across the river, Xcel has blocked or dragged its feet on virtually everything it's been asked to do, including inclusive financing. The real progress that has been made over in Minneapolis is where the city has been free to act on its own. Many of the measurable policies we propose in St. Paul will need Xcel's active involvement. Furthermore, in the next few years, we'll be entering franchise renegotiations with Excel, where we examine what we're expecting and what we're getting from our exclusive relationship.
And Ms. Dickinson, we are over time, so I want to make
Okay.
sure that as you give us the cautionary words, that
Yep.
you find the summary.
What I want to make sure is that in these negotiations, we don't get rolled, that we avoid what happened in terms of the trash debacle, and that we make sure that Excel doesn't just say the right things, but that they do the right things, just as we must do. Thank you so much.
She had so many comments and recommendations for the council on how they can work with Excel to make sure to hold them accountable, to make sure that they're not just giving them the song and dance, and how to have things so the people understand that Excel is part of this solution and not just continuing as business as usual. Well, Mr. Copeland, I want to thank you for being here today.
It's been a real pleasure to do it again with you, Diana.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
I want to speak to one issue. The plan identifies reducing single occupancy vehicle travel demand as one of its objectives, hereafter SOV. While the 9 key initiatives identified under this objective are valuable, I'm concerned that alone they will not create the kind of culture shift that's necessary to truly shift away from our dependence on SOVs. One of the key initiatives in addressing transportation emissions is to provide a stable funding source to implement the recommendations of the city's comprehensive plan. Here's my thoughts about that. I'm going to skip over the 7 facts that lead me to the proposal. The proposal is, in order to create an equitable funding source to support some of the needed efforts identified in the plan, the city should endeavor to quantify subsidies currently promoting SOV use, and based on that assessment, develop a fee structure to charge residents based on the number of motor vehicles registered to their households. Light-duty passenger and heavy-duty vehicles should be assessed at a higher rate, in part to offset the fact that federal tax loopholes have been encouraging purchases of such vehicles since 1986. A two-way split should be designated, with one portion of the fees collected for directly supporting actions identified in the plan, and the remainder of these fees should be used to provide property tax relief, specifically to households with no motor vehicles registered in a given
I'm going to focus my remarks on transportation also. I want to emphasize that decreasing vehicle miles traveled in St. Paul is key, as the plan says, and that will require a series of hard decisions from the City Council, as my council member has already noted, year in and year out. Here are some of the decisions I think that you will have to make, starting from the easiest and heading toward the most radical. Build no new car capacity lanes starting right now. Not just the obvious through lanes, but no new left turn lanes, no right turn pork chop islands. It's all increased capacity, and that will induce demand. Be serious about winter. In the plan, LM15 calls for having proactive sidewalk inspections after heavy snowfalls and resources to clear where it's needed. So put some money behind that. But also right now, how about clearing the snow from our existing bike lanes, like on Marshall Avenue, and ticketing and towing the cars that are parked in the bike lanes because the parking lane is snow narrowed. If those cars were blocking the car driving lanes, they would already be towed. Accelerate the sidewalk infill timeframe in the plan. If we want people to walk, they need somewhere to do that. So that infrastructure needs to be in place before the 2050 outcomes, not at the same time as the outcomes. Stop installing pedestrian beg buttons at every traffic light, and just have the walk signs come on automatically where the light turns green. Ban right turn on red citywide. Implement decongestion pricing. Some people call that congestion pricing, but the result is decongestion, so let's call it that, sort of like what Brian just said. Ban personal cars and light trucks. Ban personal cars and light trucks.